Now this is a developer conference, so I'm assuming that many people here are developers or wannabe developers or ex-developers or have some heritage in development. And so for us, I think XP was always a much more attractive methodology because it didn't really talk so much about what meetings you should have and who should be doing retrospectives. It talked about the actual practices. However, Scrum doesn't. Scrum looks like this. And this is, just an overview. And basically, we've got lots of meetings specified. And here in the middle, we've got 2 to 4 weeks, which is your iteration, and you've got 24 hours for your daily retrospective. It doesn't say what you do in there. And if you look at the documentation for Scrum, it doesn't say who should be in there. They're just a team member, some sort of generic plug compatible, someone who can hit keyboards. So this is what we've got. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to deliver stuff out of here and give it to the customer. Now, you may think that, in fact, to some extent, you would be right if you thought that I'm being a little bit negative about Scrum, because I've seen a lot of failed implementations of Scrum, and I've seen very few successful ones. But it's trying to do something really important. It's trying to get something to the customer, or at least something that can be reviewed by the customer every 2 to 4 weeks. And that's a huge improvement over what we used to do on the Waterfall project, where you might not see the customer for a couple of years. And so the thing about all of these agile methods, and Scrum particularly, is that it's about feedback. It's about trying to learn about your mistakes. And you want to get that feedback quickly. But it's not just enough to get feedback. So there's lots of different sorts of feedbacks. If we have any systems thinkers in the room, or people that have worked with electronics, you'll know that there's positive reinforcing feedback, there's negative balancing feedback. So what are you going to do with this feedback? What do we use it to do? And the idea of feedback is that we learn from it, that we can see this, we can measure the feedback, we can gauge it, and we take an action based on the feedback that we see. And then we've got, it gets more complicated still. You can then measure, use your measurements on that feedback to choose which way to go. And in agile methods, what we're trying to do with the feedback is go to the customer and say, is this what you wanted? Is this going in the right direction? Is this enough? Can we stop going down this path now? Or have you got a new business requirement? Have the requirements changed? And you get the feedback loop, and you build experiments, and so you can do little spikes, and so you have low risk. Are we leaving the building? No. OK, we're not leaving the building. So that's a feedback loop. We didn't learn, or did we learn? Yeah, so maybe that was a balancing feedback. Next time it will burn up. Anyway, so we analyze, we learn, and we possibly change direction. So these are all just different representations of trying to get feedback, and using that feedback to improve the chance of delivering what the customer wants. Now, we have problems with the estimating, as Alan was talking about, because the things we're trying to estimate are really quite big, generally. And until we get into the detail of it, we don't know how big they are. So generally what happens is you go and you see a store and you might have a discussion about it, you may talk about some tasks that are in there, but until you actually get into working on that story, or at least delving down into it very deeply, you don't come up against the problems that are hidden within that story, within the feature that you're trying to develop. And this is a problem of scale, of how far away something is. So this is a jokey slide, but I think, despite the fact that it's Father Ted, and clearly it's trying to tell a silly story, it really is the way it works. If you pick up something, you go, oh, that'll be easy. And 2 hours later, when you're in the debugger, you realize, no, I have to change that whole API, or that's not going to work because of the security manifest that's not on the right machine. And suddenly all the complexity arrives. That complexity was there to start with, you just hadn't seen it because you hadn't started working on it. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is about trying to get down into that detail early so that we can focus on the bits that are risky, we can focus on the bits where there may be unknowns lurking, and we focus on the bits that we need to do quickly up front so that we can begin to give people feedback about whether the project is feasible and what we might be able to deliver over the lifetime of that project. This is a very old graph. It's attributed to a guy called Barry Boehm, who is a researcher. It's been popularized by Steve McConnell in some of his books, and it's called the cone of uncertainty. And the interesting thing is that, well, let's start off by saying it's a cone, and here, the uncertainty about what you're trying to do is really quite large. And so the measurement that he's got here is that if you make an estimate right at the beginning of a project, you could be up to a factor of 4 out in both directions. And the closer you get to delivering, the more likely you are to make a good estimate. It's a really big problem, because actually we get asked to make the estimates over at that end of the cone, not at this end of the cone. Because at this end of the cone, we really don't care about it. So we need to be able to uncover some of the uncertainty here so that we can begin to give some feedback to our managers about what's possible, what we can actually achieve. Alan talked about no estimates, and no estimates is a wonderful idea, but at some point, people still need to know what's going on. And his concept of counting stories works really well if your stories are correctly sized. Now, they don't all have to be the same size, but you've had to do enough analysis that we've got them down to a point where they're reasonably sized. So a bit of variation isn't going to kill you, but a lot of variation will absolutely knock you stone dead. And a story that comes in and sits in the in progress box for 3 or 4 iterations, that blows the whole counting game out of the water. So we need to get our stories to the right size so that we can use the counting approach and get away from this huge level of uncertainty at the beginning. So Dan North has been talking about this for probably 7 or 8 years, and before him, Chris Matz was talking about it for 5 or 6 years before that, and there are loads of people that have been working in this space, understanding that, in fact, developing software is a process of learning something. We learn about the project, we learn about the technology, we learn about what we can achieve. And we need to get over the bit, we need to do as much of that learning up front. We need to get over that hump of ignorance at the beginning, because that's the stuff that stops us from being able to deliver. So, I mean, as developers, have you ever finished a project and said to yourself, if I was to do that project again, I would not do anything differently? I don't think so, because we learn. Every time we do something, we learn about it. So we're trying to get through this barrier of ignorance. And one of the problems I think that we have is that we're all experts. And we get scored and promoted and paid based on our expertise. And we don't like looking like we don't know something. This is borne out in sociological experiments where people have done tests and asked people questions to which they can reply with an answer, a fixed answer, or by saying, I don't know. And if you don't know, that's one thing. But if you answer with a fixed answer, then there's 2 possibilities. You're either right or you're wrong. And so there's these 3 possible outcomes when you ask someone a question. They can answer correctly, or they can answer incorrectly, or they can say, I don't know. And it turns out that people are far, far more likely to answer definitively, irrespective of whether they're definitely going to be right or wrong, than they are to be uncertain. They prefer to be wrong than uncertain. And this is our problem when it comes to estimates. So if you get asked to estimate something, quite often the answer is, I have no idea. But we're not allowed to say that. And we don't like saying that because it makes us look ignorant. I'm going to ask you to move from the other side. For the rest of this session, let's assume that we're ignorant. We need to find out even the slightest details to work out how are we going to solve this problem. Is it solvable? Is it soluble? So given that this is, to some extent, a talk about agile and responding to change, I'm going to say that I'm slightly changing the plan over what was advertised in the brochure. So in the brochure, I said we were going to talk about TDD in the small first, and then deal with a larger user story. And while I was working on this presentation, I decided to flip them around. So we're going to work from outside in, and we're going to start with big stories first. So I'm going to spend the next section of this presentation talking about user stories and approaches to working with them, some of which will mesh in neatly with what Alan and, to some extent, Kevin was saying earlier. And then we'll dive down in some nitty-gritty detail with some code. So, user story land. Can I just get a quick show of hands? Who doesn't use user stories at all? A few people. And keep your hands up if you don't know what they are. Okay, so I'm not going to go into any great deal of depth on user stories, because that's not the point here, as in what they are by definition. But I am going to say is that we're going to be dealing in this area here. We're looking at the stories, how we plan things, what we put into the backlog. And it's that part of the Scrum process, that part of the Agile methods that I want to talk about. So what is a story? We got a definition from Alan about a story, and he was talking about as a so that I can do this. This is J.B. Rainsberger's definition of a story, and it is a placeholder for a conversation. This comes directly from the XP method, and it's saying, look, what we're trying to do is we're trying to think about what we're going to need to deliver. We don't want to talk about it all now, because some of it we won't need, and some of it will change by the time we get there. But let's at least record the fact that we need to talk about this before we implement it. So this is a really lightweight way of defining what a story is. The reason we need the stories to be small, and these are not small, so here I'm using abstract story points, but no matter what scale you use, typically I think 8 and 13 are seen to be as large as you would like to have in your sprint backlog. So I've got two stories here, A and B, and the velocity of a team may be, well, so the nice thing about velocity is you have no idea what the velocities are. It's an abstract number. But the truth of the matter is that 13s and 8s normally take quite a few days to deliver within a sprint. It's very rare that an 8-story pointer or a 13-story pointer gets started at the beginning of a sprint and gets delivered within the first 2 or 3 days. So what happens is the story gets pulled into the sprint, and the team or someone in the team starts working on it. And at this point, we have our testers, because although we talk about cross-functional, multi-functional teams, every team I've seen so far has got some people that do more testing and some people that do more development within it. And so at the beginning, your tester is sitting there chilling out, thinking about test plans or catching up on CPD or maybe filling in stuff from the previous sprint. And the time marches onwards, and you get closer and closer to the sprint deadline. Oh dear, and suddenly the day before the sprint ends, all the stories miraculously get completed and checked in, because that's how we're going to keep our velocity high. And the testers are now totally frustrated, overworked, and need help. And by the end, we've got some dead testers who are really exhausted and need that period of relaxation at the beginning of the next sprint to cope with it. So, a jokey slide, but the point is that large stories don't flow smoothly through the process. You may have more than 2 or 3 stages in your process, or you may just have that one in progress in the middle. But nonetheless, the smaller the item is, the more smoothly it passes through, probably the better you understand it, and the less chances it's got a huge amount of risk inside it. Which brings us back to story planning, planning poker rather. So planning poker so I completely concur with Alan. Planning poker is an entirely bogus. So Ron Jeffries started off by inventing it, and he kind of regrets that now. It was built on the finding that as humans, we are better at doing relative estimation than absolute estimation. So saying, this thing is twice as big as that thing. But actually, it doesn't work like that in software. So you could have a reference story that you say your 1-pointer, and that maybe took a week. And another one, you go, that's a 2-pointer. It's twice as big. It doesn't work like that. Every little piece of software, or at least in general, your different stories have enough variation in them, so you can't just say this is twice as big as something else. So this whole effort of pretending that we all listen to each other and understand what the problems are, and then we democratically vote on it, it's tedious, it's error-prone. And this is a far better way. This is very much akin to the counting mechanism that Vasco is talking about. This one comes from Pavel Borodinski in Krakow. And basically, there's a 0 card, which isn't on this actual slide. But basically, he says it's either a 0, it's a 1-pointer, or, and this I think is what was missing from Alan's presentation, there are 2 other cards, which obviously I can't pronounce because they're rude, but the T stands for 2, and the B stands for big, and the N stands for no, and the C stands for clue. And so that's the way the stories are, right? So it's either so small we can turn it out really quickly and then move it on and deliver it, or it's too big, which means we need to split it down, or we really don't have any idea and we need to do some sort of spike or investigation. So this is the approach that I think we should be working towards. And a lot of mature teams, even they don't use these cards because they don't need to, do that naturally. So when you start working with stories, you find that things move more smoothly when the stories are small, and you can deliver many stories throughout the length of the iteration. And so you then tend to break your stories up into smaller deliverables, into smaller slices through the application, and that then allows you to dispense with a lot of the estimation. So my colleague Matt Wynn worked at Songkick, and they used to break their stories down, and they got to the point where they could break them down so effectively that they stopped counting the points, they stopped estimating the points, and they just said, we deliver about 8 or 12 stories a sprint. But you can't just go straight there. You have to be good at splitting them down, and that's a skill. So we split them to do, so this is the slide actually that me and Alan shared. It's a slightly different version of it, but it's from the same slide deck. And it's the story planning, and we want to split them because it gives us flexibility. It allows us to pick the things that are valuable, pick the things that are risky, and elevate them up front into the planning process. So this is story mapping, or user story mapping, and user story mapping is a technique that has been written about and developed by Jeff Patton, and his book, imaginatively entitled User Story Mapping, came out at the end of last year. And if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend that you get a copy, because it truly, for me, is the missing Agile book. And it's a way of trying to harness the process that you're trying to deliver and using the expertise of your marketers and your product owners and your customers to work out which bits need to be done to make a release, or at least a sprint deliverable that makes sense, so that we can test some sort of journey, so that we can get feedback on what the customer's going to be doing. And remember from the beginning, the whole goal of user stories, and in fact the whole goal of the Agile ways of working, is so that we can ship something early, we get feedback from our customers, so we're not going down a blind alley in the wrong direction. Can you go down a blind alley in the wrong direction? I don't know. So, there's this idea of minimum viable product, which plays into this space. We want to do something that is worthwhile for our customers. And I'm not going to go into detail about this. Basically, we want to be up here. We want to have not too many features, but we want the features that are to get there to actually deliver some value and be able to get useful feedback. So we can spend a lot of time developing a really funky login screen, but that's not going to deliver a huge amount of value to our customers. Maybe, though, we know we're going to have some security, but we can dispense with the login while we're getting the feedback, because the value in the product is whatever is unique about it. It's this problem that we're trying to solve. Which takes us neatly to the INVEST acronym. Are people familiar with this one? There's a few nods. So this is from Mike Cohn, again, another Agile author. And it's a wonderful acronym, and has caused so many problems in the Agile community and people trying to adopt Agile, that I think we can either dispense with it, or we need to at least address 2 bits over here. So the INVEST acronym is supposed to help you decide if a story is a good story. And some of these I'm not even going to talk about. I have no argument with. Independent, however, I have a huge amount of difficulty with. Because independent, for me, assumes that if you've got a bag of stories, you can pick any one of them and implement it whenever you feel like it. And that's patently untrue. Okay, so independent is not you don't need to be independent to be a good story. So the many stories in the world have prerequisites that need to be done first. So there's clearly a linear ordering of some deliverables. What he's trying to get across with independent here is that once the prerequisites for stories have been satisfied, you can choose any of the stories that remain and implement them, develop and deliver them separately. So it's independent in that you don't have to deliver 2 stories in parallel at the same time. So you don't have to deliver the front-end story and the back-end story at the same time. That's a good example of a bad way of partitioning stories. The other one that I have issues with is valuable. So product owners often say, I'm not looking at this, that's not what we're going to ship to the customer, it's not customer valuable, you just keep going. This is not the value that we're after here. So the value that we're after here is an incremental value that's moving us towards something that's shippable to the customer. We want feedback early. The product owners that we want are the product owners that sit there and say, I would like to see every time you commit. I want to see your demos every 2 or 3 days, not I'm going to wait till the end of the iteration. So this is what we're after. We're looking for value in the sense that we're addressing some of the needs and we can get some feedback on it. Liz Keogh's got another way of trying to analyze stories, features, capabilities to decide whether they're valuable or not, whether you should try and prioritize them or not. And it's a really simple one. It's like, have we done it before? Has someone done it before? All the way down at the end to no one in the world has ever done it. And her contention is that, the 4s and the 5s, where very few people have done it or nobody has done it, that's where the value of your product's going to be. That's where the risk in delivering your product is going to be. So these had better be the things that you work on early on, because all the login screens in the world are not going to sell your product if its unique selling point doesn't exist or is too difficult to deliver. And just to play into the space that I think Alan was leaving, there's another way of doing this called naked planning, which comes from a guy called Arlo Belshi, who works out of somewhere in America, I believe. And this is a very nice idea which sort of melds both the counting and the story planning, in that he basically says he has an arbitrary limit of 7 stories in the backlog. And these stories have actually a slightly different definition. He calls them minimum marketable features. So here they're probably slightly bigger than stories in the sense that I would be describing. And you pull them off the backlog. All that the product owner has to do is prioritize those 7 stories. That's all he gets to do. When you pull a story off, there's a gap. He can put another story in, any story he likes. Down here, you start putting the date of when the story gets onto the backlog. You then measure the date of when it comes off and gets delivered. And over a very short period of time, you average that time. And so he then creates what he calls the Disneyland wait time estimate, which says average waiting time from this point is around 45 days. And that then satisfies that prediction goal that Vasco and Alan were talking about earlier. So this is a really nice, lightweight way of working, probably on small to medium teams, not for your large organization. And the minimum marketable feature is essentially, it's minimal because if you got rid of anything, it wouldn't be marketable, and it's marketable because someone actually was prepared to use it. So that was all preamble. Now we're down to how are we going to split these things. So the answer is, there's lots of different ways of splitting stories. This is purposefully small. I don't want us to read it just here. However, what I do want you to understand is that this is probably the most valuable piece of paper that has ever been published in the Agile space on the internet. And you should definitely go to Agile for All, which is Richard Lawrence's website, and print it out, because he's made it freely available to everybody. And it's a wonderful way of working. However, it's far more than I can deal with in the 20 minutes that I've got to work through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to commend it to you and then move on. Instead, I'm going to move to back to J.B. Rainsberger. And he's taken one of those heuristics off of the story splitting sheet, and he's reframed it. He's a jokey character, and so he's reframed it in a jokey way. And so he's got a 3-point plan. So take your product, your vision, your idea of the product, and write out any meaningful end-to-end scenario. So this is possibly the most, the happy path through it, or what your targeted market segment is going to do, or the person that you think is going to deliver the most value to the company, or the person you need to demo at the next trade show. So we'll just write out in detail their journey. And this is exactly the same as Jeff Patton asks you to do in user story mapping. You're basically trying to plan out an experiment. This is what's going to happen. This is what the customer's going to do. But now that you've chosen that one real scenario, go through each step and ask yourself, is there any simplifying assumption that I can make that gets rid of this step? So we're going to try this in a minute. And so we then use those assumptions to simplify the scenario. And step 3 is like so many step 3s, which is wash and Wash, rinse, and repeat. I quite like his 5 minutes thought limit as well. So I'm going to talk about, we're going to do an example here, and we're going to do it using Shouty. So what we've been using so I work with a bundle of colleagues, and we sort of loosely call ourselves Kickstart. And we've been using a Twitter experiment in our training for a number of years. And Liz Keogh came and did some work with us a few months ago, and her and Aslak came up with Shouty. So Shouty is a product idea, and this is it. Shouty is a social networking application for short physical distances. When someone shouts, only people within 500 meters can hear it. So here we are. It's not Twitter. It's not global. It's completely different. It's about local communities. You sign up for it. I guess it must be on a phone. Probably it uses GPS. If you're within the distance of the person shouting, it comes up on your phone. If you're out with that distance, you don't hear about it. So that's a different way of doing filtering. Sounds good? So here it is. This is pulled directly off of GitHub. This is the Ruby instructions. Shouty doesn't exist yet. You will implement it yourself. So we're not going to implement it. Let's be clear about that. That's not what we're going to do today. We're going to work through a scenario. There's a C# version. You'll notice that the C# version is really quite similar. What I find odd is that the Java version is a bit different. Somehow, Java people have got better hearing. So there we go. So the way this plays is we need to do a bit of brainstorming to start with. So who's going to be involved in it? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the participants in the Shouty world? And then once we've done that, which we're going to assemble on this flip chart over here, we're going to try and identify one scenario and just walk through it in detail. So I'm afraid that means I'm going to need to encourage you to do for a bit of audience interaction. So brainstorming with 50 people is really hard. But let's give it a shot. First off, have I explained the application? Is it too complicated? Are there any points that you would like me to go over again? OK, so who are the main stakeholders in this application? Just shout out names. Think about it. It's like Twitter, but it's Shouty. Sorry? Application users. OK. Is there just one sort of application user? Do you think there'll just be a single sort?
People who want to shout.
OK, yes, so shouters. You're shouted, sir. OK. Shoutees. Can I maybe just call them listeners? OK, I'll say shoutees, then that's fine. Got to listen to my customers. Is anyone else, are there any other stakeholders? Sorry? Finance. Yes. OK. Marketing.
Some kind of moderators.
Moderators. Maybe. DevOps. OK. So we're now really going to the back office, aren't we, and here into the metal. So it looks to me like the actual users, we've only got shouters and shoutees. I think we need to explore whether they're actually different sorts of people, but let's see. So can we just leave that one there? There's not that much on there, so I'm going to just flip it over. What might be the principal pathway through this? Let's, in minute detail, concrete detail, what's the, if you're going to do an elevator pitch, what happens? How do you use this application? OK? OK?
Open the app.
Yep. Sure, sorry, yes. So far we have come up with a shout or something to say, open the app, type some characters, and press the button. So does that strike people as a reasonable path through the application? Is there enough concrete details there? Or are there more things that we want to cover?
Authorize. Do we specify whether it's only a shout or is it type? Does it have to be typing?
Does it have to be typing? Okay. There was someone said also about authorization. So is it necessary to type? Do we need to do any authorization or authentication? Okay. So is it enough just to be able to shout? Location. Yes, so we've got to have the shouty listening or hearing. So how's the shouty going to hear? Sorry? Notification. Sorry? Network connection. So I think they both need that, don't they? Okay. And should we add GPS here? We've got location, but if we don't have GPS, we're not going to be able to know who's where. Any others? Sorry? Operating system. So I'm not sure that that's part of a... So I'm thinking that you wouldn't have that as actually a path through the scenario. That's some sort of non-functional requirement about where we're going to be developing for. So we're beginning to pull something together, and in the interests of speeding this up, I think let's rework it now that we've done that initial bit of brainstorming. So we've got to open up an app, so we probably have to install the application. We have to open up the app. I'm going to suggest that we're going to have to register an account. I know we didn't talk about that, but I think that's going to be part of the deliverable. And then we're going to, there might be all sorts of things there about validation. Then we're going to enter shout, however that might be. Broadcast, shout, complete with GPS data. And that's probably the end of the shouting. And then over here, we've got an equal. You might want to register an account when you're listening. And then receive broadcast. Filter by distance. Display shout. So we have two paths, but I think probably we're going to only have time to do one of them today. So what's simplifying? Let's deal with the shout, because I think that one's probably the simpler of the two, and it's the one that naturally we think of. So what simplifying assumptions can we make about installing the app? Already installed. Okay, opening the app. There you go. I know what you're going to say to this one. Registering the account? Already registered. Okay, entering a shout. So is that a simplifying assumption? So that's a really good, so are we getting to the point where it's no longer minimal if we've already shouted? So I don't think we can go that far, but do we have to enter the shout? Sorry? Yeah. So maybe we have a fixed shout, or we just have a shout button and we don't have to enter something and it always sends the shout method. Broadcast the shout. So we'll leave that. GPS data. So we've gone through this. We clearly have to do some work, but we've got a story that now basically says broadcast shout. Now, the tasks that come into this, if this was your bootstrap story, you're clearly still going to have to build an app, compile it, install it, get it on the application, on your platform that you're going to do some testing on. But you've now got enough infrastructure to be able to send something away. There's a bit that's missing. If you remember from the INVEST acronym, the last letter in it is T, which is testable. So how would we test this broadcast shout? You could do mocks, exactly. So we could have a mock server, or we could have a real server. Is this how we normally work? Do we take a story, do we look at a path through an application and try and do as little as possible? So I don't know about you, but the places that I generally find myself consulting in, doing as little as possible is seen as being lazy. What we were continually being asked to do is do as much as possible. And this is quite alien to a lot of people, about saying, look, we know we're going to have to log in, we'll have to have a username, we're going to have a password, we're going to have to understand about GPS data, we're going to have to do the whole account registration stuff. And we can take weeks doing that up front, or we might download something off the internet to do it for us. But nonetheless, these are the bits that are the least interesting. So the interesting bits here are the broadcasting the shout and making sure that over here, you only get to hear the shout if you're within range of it being shouted. And at that point, you've got something to demonstrate, and you can test it. And now we can ask questions about which 500 meters is it? Is it 500 meters at the point that you broadcast the shout? Or is it 500 meters at the point that the shout hits the server? Or if you move within 500 meters of the shout within 10 minutes of it being shouted, is that part of the feature set? And now we're getting into really interesting space where you can start asking about the features of the product. You can start implementing them, testing them, giving them to users to get feedback on, all without ever having done a login screen, all without ever having put it into the App Store. And this is just one of the ways that is listed on that sheet about trying to break things down to thin stripes through the application. Now, thin stripes through the application do not mean you have to touch each bit of it. Some of them you can just hard code. So here, for instance, when we talk about broadcast shout, one way would be to fling up an edit box and you type in it. Another way would just be have a button and you broadcast just a packet that says, I have shouted. So what do you think of that? We've got some shouty people in the audience. Does it feel like a different way of working? Do you think it'd be doable at your place of work?
It doesn't feel like it's a feature you can sell to someone. I mean, I understand that you're getting the value.
Yep. So that's absolutely true. And that's when I talked about the V for valuable in the INVEST acronym. This is not a minimum marketable feature. So this is not playing into the naked planning space. This is a valuable story in that it gives you enough information to be able to decide that this is not going to work, to be able to decide whether you want to invest more money in the project. And when I say you, I mean the product owner or the customer who's footing the bill. So I would agree. What we've talked about here is absolutely not something that I would want to install on my telephone. So we've done that. I've asked you that. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about TDD. These are two parts of the same coin. So when I work with my colleagues at Kickstart, we're often doing behavior driven development or specification by example. And when we're working in that space, we're looking to use concrete examples like the one I just described to make our stories really small and just do the minimum that we can to prove something for our customer. And behavior-driven development, BDD, and test-driven development, TDD, are very similar approaches. They often get put in completely separate buckets and dealt with by separate sorts of people. But we need to think about what they are. So both of them work from the outside in. So both BDD and TDD, you as either the developer or the product owner need to think about how is the customer or the client going to interact with your application or your source code. You're thinking about it before you implement it. It's a design activity. Both of them use examples. So in BDD, we're thinking about examples that are expressed in the domain language, the ubiquitous language. In TDD, we're thinking about unit tests, which are themselves examples of how the code is going to be used. And in both of them, they document the system. So in BDD, it turns into living documentation because it's written in the domain language and everyone can read it, and you can see whether it's passed or failed. So you can go to it, and it's a source of truth about what the system does. In TDD, it's developer-facing. It's written in your favorite programming language, but it's still readable. You should be able to understand what your application does, what your code is intending to do from reading your unit tests. So I mean, there's something implicit here that we're writing good BDD examples, and we're writing good unit tests. And one of the essential properties of both is that they should be readable and understandable. So in test-driven development, I'm going to use a separate example. I don't know, has anyone seen this kata before? So this is around, it's just a simple, small problem, and so the problem statement is lovely and short. It says, if you're given a letter, print a diamond starting with A, with a supplied letter at the widest point. So, if you're asked to print a diamond for the letter C, you start with A, and then you go to B, and now C is at the widest point, and then it starts coming in again to B and to A. So you can see if it was D, then we would have a D here, which was even wider, and then it would go C, B, A beneath. So just as developers, just think for a couple of minutes, how long is that going to take you to implement? Any guesses? Let's put it on complexity. Is it trivially simple, hideously hard, or somewhere in between? Sorry? Somewhere in between. Okay, no, I agree. Does anyone, so I'm going to go through and do a sort of demo here. Has anyone got a laptop they want to race me and see if we can get it out faster? So there are some issues here, okay? So before, sorry? Not only have I done it before, I'm not even going to do any typing. I've got it all recorded. Yeah. So you've seen the demo effect with the video. I'm not going to do demo effect with code as well. Dear me. So what problems might there be? Can you, before you've even gone in there, let's do a little bit of, before we put hands in motion typing on the keyboard, what are the issues with this problem statement? As in, what might be difficult? Where do you put the A? Sorry? Okay, so interestingly, let's say that there's only, there's one space here, and there's two spaces there. So here we've got fixed fonts. Okay, well, so let's go through the TDD and see how it works. I'm going to demonstrate in two different TDD ways, right? So there's one approach that I think demonstrates why TDD is is hard to learn, and I think certainly the intention of me doing this demonstration is to show you that it's because we're trying to take too big a jump. So let's see whether you agree with me. Of course, now I have to see whether I can get the thing to work here, because the screen was causing me issues. So this is Cyber Dojo. Has anyone used Cyber Dojo? Nobody. Okay, so cyber-dojo.com is a really wonderful website created and maintained by a colleague of mine called John Jagger, and it's a place to practice programming. It's an online environment built in with 20 or 30 different programming languages and about 40 or 50 different example problems to work on. And it's for up to 9 pairs of people to work on the same problem at the same time. Every time you press, there's only a test button, there's no save button. You have to write tests, otherwise your application doesn't run. When you press the test button, it packages up your source code, it sends it off to the server, commits that into source control. And so what you get is you get a history of your efforts, and you can then see your timeline compared to everybody else's timeline, and you can go back and see every diff and who did what. And in that way, you can then, after the fact, talk through each other's solutions and hopefully learn. So in this particular one, I'm going to have to take some time to introduce it. We have this diamond test. This is how I started in my first attempt. And so what I said, so the way you start with, is that readable? Yeah? That's going to be painful for me. Is that better? Yeah? So this is C#. I apologize for anyone who isn't a C# reader. But the way you start in unit tests is you start with something as trivially simple as possible. So I've skipped over the null or the error checking, and I've gone straight to the really smallest diamond. And this is print diamond for A. Okay? And so we didn't cover that in the problem statement. But actually, if you do look at the problem statement in more detail, or the one that's online, the smallest diamond when you pass an A is just a single A is what's returned. Because you can't write, it's at the widest point, and there's a single A. And so what we're saying here is that what we want, after we called create the diamond with A, is we want a string back which has an A in it. So what I did here was I wrote the test, and then I ran it, and of course, I have to move backwards and forwards, and it failed because I hadn't implemented any code yet. Then I went and did some implementation of code, as you do. And I did the simplest thing. So this is the way TDD works. You get write a failing test, you see it fail, and then you make it pass in the simplest way possible. In this case, we're expecting an A back, so I return an A back. This is the point when non-TDDers roll their eyes and say, that's dumb. Okay, so you're welcome to do that. I then moved on and I wrote another test. Because actually, no, I didn't demonstrate it, but it's green now. That passed. Tests run 1, error 0. So then I moved on and wrote a failing test. So you can see that from this F here. And the test that I wrote was B, should generate A, B, B, A. Now, that's not very nice to look at, but nonetheless, it is, I contend it is what we were looking for. Because if you were to print that out, you would in fact get a space A, B, space B, A. And so I put it in a linear string. This is going to get tedious if we get into up to Z, but nonetheless, it'll do for now for this demo. And of course, that failed. I must have put a syntax error in there, but there you go. Now I moved it into a pass. And to make it pass, so essentially I did a really trivial check. So what am I going to do now? How am I going to get from here to the solution? And so just to demonstrate how badly this can go, I then went one further and said, oh, right, well, now I'm going to do it for C. We see where this is going. So this is actually a tractable problem. We could write one massive switch statement with 26 cases in it, and then just say only A to Z are valid. But the problem here is one that I think we see in user stories and we see in a lot of our algorithmic development, which is there's a lot of problems that need to be solved all at once. So there's, in the test-driven development cycle, that you go red, green, refactor. And in refactor is where you're supposed to spot the things that can be generalized and generalize them. The trouble is there's a lot of things to be generalized. So as someone pointed out, there's how many spaces should come before the A. By the time you get to C, A, B, C, D, E, it's like you have to generalize how many spaces do I need to create before a letter. Then there's the how many spaces should there be between letters. Then there's the, oh, there's a repetition. We've got to go from A to the midpoint and then from the midpoint back to A again. And so now that's at least 3 issues there. And the TDD process, because we're trying to solve all 3 of those at once, is problematic. And people at that point go, I'm just going to solve the whole problem. And what happens, and I've seen this time and time again, because actually I use this as an interview question. What happens is you then go into a 30-minute cycle of trying to code it up. You've got these 2 or 3 tests that are passing with a switch statement, and then you have to somehow replace that switch statement with something large and monolithic that satisfies all of those conditions. And the problem is, until you can satisfy all those conditions, the test is failing again. So one of the ways that I've approached it is to break this down. And the way I've broken it down, that's not what I wanted to do, is this one. No, come on. Where's it gone? But it's got me the diff. That's because I've got to go over here. No. It's not happy. I've still got a... where's it gone? It's still because it's just too big, isn't it? Nope. It's got confused. Wonderful software. So, let's get rid of the diff. We start in the same way. We get ourselves to A. This time we're going to go off and make it pass, and we make it pass by returning A again. Step 2 is similar to the previous step 2. In fact, it's exactly the same, but we start with just going for AB. Rather than going for the shape, I'm saying, actually now, I need a sequence. The sequence is going to be A followed by B, because B is the midpoint. So we're making a really small step. We've made a simplification. We're saying we're not going to print the diamond this time. We're just going to print the start of the sequence. We're going from A to B. So this then becomes quite easy to write the solution to. So you notice the pattern here? So we've got the same pattern. But now when we come to do the refactoring, we've got an opportunity to we see a pattern emerging. And so we can do a refactoring and turn it into a loop. So now I've got a loop that satisfies my previous condition. And then, if I was to put in C, it would give me ABC. So let's bite off another part of the problem. Internet. It's all very well preparing things. There you go. So now I've gone back and I've edited the test. So I've coined the term test recycling, which you may or may not like. But nonetheless, what we have now is a test that rather than just be A and B, is that we've noticed that in the solution, we don't just go A and B, but we've got two Bs. So now we're getting all the way to the middle line by getting the duplicates in place. And so let's make sure what happens is as expected. So we get it to pass, and we get it to pass by putting in a check to see whether it's whether we've at A, because A is always a single character, and all the other characters are always duplicated up. And so you can see probably where this is going. I'm building this solution in really small slices. So now I'm putting in the new lines. Still haven't got to the bottom half, still not worried about spaces at the beginning, still not worried about spaces in the middle. But I have tests that pass, and then I make a small change to the specification to make it closer to what I want to deliver. So it's the same process that I'm suggesting that we use in user stories. We start with something which isn't what the customer asked for, but is a step on the path to what the customer wants. So to make that one pass, do a little bit of stuff. So here we're putting the new lines, and we can move along and see the next one. So after that, I've got, what did I do to change that one? I should indent some lines. So the next step is I'm making sure that we're getting indentation at the beginning of the line. We move slightly further along, and I must have been doing some refactoring there. So here now we're putting spaces between the repeated characters, and so we make that pass. And each of these steps is really, really small. The changes that we're making are not huge. So for instance, if we switch the diff on, you can see that the change that I made was trivially simple to move from one to the other. And the wonderful thing about this is that your tests are never read for very long, which means that you can stop at any point, you can go away, your builds are still going to work. One of the games that John Jagger plays with his groups is called Mean Time to Green. And he sets people up on CyberDojo with a problem. And then he says, when I ring the bell, you all have to get to green as quickly as possible. And the first couple of times, they're always trying to get their existing failing test to get to green. And then they realize that you get points, and obviously points mean prizes, you get points for getting to green as quickly as possible. And the quickest way to get to green is to revert to the last known good green. Because actually the important thing is that you're in a known good state. Test-driven development is about staying at green as much as possible, and which is why in that get to green, you want to get there as quickly as possible by doing something shameless. And so what I'm trying to say here is that we can do much smaller slices, as long as we can see a path from where we are now to where our customers want us to get to where the solution is, then by doing small things, we get there much, much more safely, because at every point in the step, we have got tests that help us know when our refactorings have broken something. And actually this, without too much effort, builds really neatly up into a solution that solves the problem. And here we've got to it. And it's now generalized in such a way that I can chuck a C in there. I think I probably have that as an example. Could be wrong. Might not be able to get to it. Yeah. I just chuck it in. Now it's got so complicated that I've even laid it out in a structure that makes it easy to read, and it passed the first time. Now, that's something that when I work with really experienced software engineers can often take 40 minutes. Because by the time you've invested in getting to the final ABBA and trying to get the right output, you then have to make that huge jump to getting the algorithm complete and correct. Whereas by splitting it down and seemingly doing extra work, delivering pointless interim solutions, you get there much, much quicker and with a lot less stress. And that, I think, is an important thing. Certainly, that's important for me. So, what do people think about that? I'd like to know if that's something that you've tried before or something that interests you, or you hate it. Yeah. Okay, so I was working with a telecoms company, and they were re-architecting their whole stack for doing mobile phone networks. And they were saying, well, we've got this new framework, and we're going to need to implement every layer of it, and we're going to need to write a test that makes sure that it works at every layer, and it will take about 4 months. And I said, well, don't we just need to make sure to start with that the layers talk to each other? And so we started off by writing a test to get layer 1 and 2 talking to each other, and so it was pinging and we were getting a response. And then we added more layers in until we got it going through the stack. And by the end of day 2, we actually had the stack communicating all the way from the UI front end, which was simulating a phone, through to the network masks, mocked, obviously, and back again. And that, that was, for me, that was an eye-opener. For them, it was an eye-opener, because they really thought they were not going to be able to do any testing, any automation, or demonstrate anything until after they had got at least something fleshed out at every layer. So a similar one is if you've seen the Growing Object-Oriented Software book by Freeman and Price, they've got, so again, it's a contrived example, but it's a bigger contrived example than this one, and it's around, it's about sniping on eBay. It's not eBay, but it's sniping on a network. And they do the same thing. They build it up in really, really small slices. Some slices are ones that you would never deliver to a customer, that you're just doing for technical feedback. Some get to the granularity where you will show them to a customer to get feedback about whether it's the right direction to be going in. And then finally, you get to that minimum marketable set, minimum viable product where you could actually say, we're going to stop here and now we're going to sell it and see if anyone actually likes it. So, so yes, I have seen it work in practice. Yes, it is a contrived example, but this is a kind of contrived environment as well. It'd be great to try it on something else. What sort of applications stack do you work with? Okay. So I mean, general web applications are classic examples where you can do this all the time, aren't they? Because almost always the first thing that comes with a general web application is a really complicated UI document that some designer has put together. But actually most of the functionality is either in JavaScript or somewhere in the back end. And if we can get something that you can do through some sort of really hastily thrown together page with a couple of text boxes and a submit button, then you can start testing out the infrastructure, demonstrating that the functionality hangs together, and actually even trying to show that it adds value. And then you can layer some UI stuff on top of it.
What about security? Because people always talk about security, and I guess mobile devices getting to work on different screen sizes, you always want to have that in from the start. But that makes it more complicated to do this sort of development.
The question was about mobile screen sizes and the fact that, well, so I think it was a multi-led question, but it was around security and is something that needs to be in from the start, and also mobile phone devices come with lots of different form factors, and you need to get that sort of thing in from the start. And it's absolutely true that not everything is amenable to doing like this. So Kevlin, who was on first, if you ever speak to him about architecture and design, he'll talk to you at length about the difference between architecture and design, but it hinges on how much is it going to cost to change your mind later. So I don't advocate just sitting down and trying to do this mindlessly, in the same way that I don't advocate trying to sit down and write a web app mindlessly. The way you have to go about it is think about what's uncertain. So maybe use Liz's complexity analysis, look at some of the non-functional requirements of the system, which are going to be things that you need to explore early on. And if there are some that you don't know about, or some that you know absolutely are going to be constraints in the future, then you have to do a spike or an investigation to come up with a solution for that right up front. So the trouble with software engineering, or in fact any human endeavor, is there's never one solution. And so what I'm definitely not trying to say here is that your whole life is going to be simple now, and all you ever have to do is slice things into really small pieces. There are some things that you need to do some investment up front, and some things really you do have to do some architecture and architectural design, which is in fact where the Price and Freeman book gets really strong, because they talk about Alistair Coburn's walking skeleton, where right at the beginning you think about the architecture of your application and put up a proof of concept on which you can hang these small slices of functionality as you move forward. Now, I would suggest that security is part of the non-functional requirements, and that needs to come up front. So banks that I work for generally have what they call a security wrapper, and you basically go off to your enterprise architect, and he hands you a security bumper pack, and this is the code that you have to use, and you get no choice about it at all. Other places will have slightly more flexible arrangements, but you still want to talk about them up front and make sure that you understand if there are constraints that you're going to need to satisfy. But these are quite often at levels of complexity that are not novel. They're not things that are going to be new. Now, I think your form factor is another one, where I think the form factors have proven to be really quite problematic. And at the point of you thinking about doing a cross-platform, cross-form factor application for a mobile app, you have a really difficult decision about whether you're going to go for some sort of library that is going to try and isolate you from those problems and get all the problems of poorly designed libraries that we all know and love, or whether you're going to roll it yourself for the form factors that you think are key and try and build in some flexibility. And both of those there are trade-offs to be made there, because one is going to take you a lot of effort and you might screw up, and the other is going to cost you a lot of money and they might screw up. And it's whether you're prepared to play that game. I mean, the same has been going on forever when it comes to what web browsers you target. So how many people are still targeting IE6? Wow, nobody. Okay, well, that's good. But there is, it was a choice that people had to make until really quite recently. Are we going to invest that effort? And that's something that it's not actually in the purview of the developers only to make that decision. It's around marketers and salespeople. Any other observations at the moment? Okay. So this, as part of this approach, I was working on it for quite a while last year down at the TDD level, and I was looking at it and thinking about write a failing test, and this was the bit that I think caused me the problem. So as you notice, as I was going through that particular solution, I only wrote 2 tests, and then I spent a lot of the time rewriting that second test. What I was doing was I was making the specification more tight. I was making it more detailed, more focused on what the customer wanted. So I've proposed a slight addition to the rules of TDD. And so I'm going to say, rather than just write a failing test, you either write a failing test or make an existing test fail. Because I think that, although it was always implicit, I think it was worthwhile making it explicit. It can be useful to just take a test and say, I'm now changing the specification. So I think we've talked a bit about these two approaches. We talked about them separately. Do you think they're the same approach? What I'm talking about when we make simplifying assumptions, thinking about a scenario, a path through an application from a user story perspective, and making simplifying assumptions about the specification that needs to be satisfied by code that we're developing in a test-driven way. Do you agree with me that there's a similarity to these approaches? Some nods. It's one of those things that hopefully you can take away and have a think about it. These slides will be available both on the DevWeek website and on SlideShare after the show. For me, it was, because I've been working both these ways now separately for a number of years, and it was a bit of a moment of just eyes opening when I realized that actually it's the same approach being used in both places. And that resonated with me on several levels. First, because as I explained at the beginning, I see BDD and TDD as being essentially different expressions of the same thing. And so the fact that an approach to slicing things down into smaller, less rigorous deliverables so that I could learn more about it and do things in a safer, less stressed way, the fact that I could apply that at both levels really helped. There's one thing that as I passed through the TDD world, there's this one thing that came up from Uncle Bob maybe 2-3 years ago, and he calls it the transformation priority premise. And I have to mention it because I don't think enough people know about it, and it's a wonderful Uncle Bobism. So what he's been doing is, he's been doing this, I don't know, have you ever seen an Uncle Bob kata where he does a prime numbers or the bowling game solution on video? Oh, he's a showman, it's wonderful stuff. But essentially he's been practicing for years TDD. It was him that framed up these 3 TDD rules along with Kent Beck in the original, back in the days of XP. And quite recently he said that he'd been experimenting again with the prime numbers kata. And he had been trying to work out, sometimes when he does it, he takes a different path. So the change that he makes between one test and the next varied. And sometimes it got him into the dead end, and sometimes the solution came out really nicely. And he was trying to find out whether there was some reason for him getting into the dead end, whether there's a way of making sure that TDD worked through smoothly. And he's come up with this premise. So a premise, I believe, is weaker than a hypothesis. And that's not quite as strong as a theory. And it's definitely not a fact. So it's just something to play around with. But his premise is that each time you write a test, you're asking for, you're requiring yourself to make a transformation to the code that you're writing. So basically, the transformation is you're changing something about the code. The test is forcing you to change the code. And you use these transformations, you change the code to make a currently failing test pass. So you're going from red back to green. But the interesting bit is that he thinks that there's an ordering. He's not sure whether it's a strict ordering or partial ordering, but there's an ordering. And if you follow that ordering and you make the highest priority changes first, you are more likely to reach a solution without a point of impasse. So that first solution I showed in the print diamond kata, where you went from A to ABA, ABBA to ABBB, CCC, BBA, and what do I do next? There we were going down a poor path through the transformations. And so and I would suggest, and certainly it feels to me like I'm going through the ordering in a better way when I did it in the small slices in the second solution. And he's got this list, and it's quite a long list. But essentially, you start with no code, and the first transformation is it returns a null. So I don't know if you ever played this. Sometimes you're returning a null, sometimes that doesn't quite work and you return an empty string or you return a 0. And that then leads you on to the constants, and then you go from one constant to maybe several constants, and then you move into scalars with arguments, and it gets more and more complex until down here you've got variables and assignments, and you've got functions being called, etc. And it feels right. Now, there's been no academic research done to back it up, and in fact, Bob's gone quiet on it for the past 3 years, so maybe he hasn't found it to be that useful. But it's a great blog post, and I think it's a really interesting addition to the TDD discussion. So, I'm going to conclude. The reason I think we want to deliver quickly is because we want to get feedback. The whole basis of agile ways of working is that we get feedback regularly, quickly, that we can act on. We can decide we go in the wrong direction, we can pivot, we can change things. I think we want to deliver small pieces to manage risk. All software projects have risk, and risk is the thing that will kill many software projects if we don't address it early enough. So the fact that we identify small slices and prioritize them, either based on the complexity analysis that Liz was talking about, the 1 through 5, or based on the value to the customer identified by your product owner, that allows you to manage risk because you can deliver smaller things to check whether that's what's wanted, if that's going to work. And I think we learn more by delivering less. So if you try and deliver a huge thing, I think you can often get lost in all of the details. So, for instance, the print diamond example, which I know is a contrived example, but when I've done that with quite senior software developers, when they get into that mode of trying to get the generalized solution all in one, not only do they come out of it much slower than people who did it in smaller chunks, but the code is typically less easy to understand because they have been flailing around looking for solutions. And at that point, the learning is completely confused and fuddled up in messy code. Whereas by doing things in small increments, you learn what the rules of the system are. So in the print diamond, the rules of the system are the number of spaces before the character is exactly equal to the position of the character minus the midpoint. So that distance gives you the number of spaces. And the space between two characters is exactly equal to 2 times the distance minus 1. And it's like, oh, now that I've done this, it's really clear, and it's in the code, and I can see this. But when the people arrive at the solution in a more indirect route, that learning is often obscured. And so we haven't learned things. And I think the same is true of working with user stories. By delivering small stories where we focus on what the customer wants, what's delivering value, where the risks have been identified, we will learn about what's risky, we will learn about what the customer really likes, and that happens faster than if we spend a lot of time trying to polish off little bits of it and deliver a finished product straight away. So that was less is more. I'm been around for the rest of the week, so if anyone would like to talk to me so you don't have to shouty out in front of everybody, that's absolutely fine. This is a book on using Cucumber with Java, which I published earlier this year. There's a discount code if you're working in Java and you want to use BDD with Cucumber, then what can I say? This is, in fact, the only book on it, so go on. You know it makes sense. So that's the discount code. It's valid for a month. Thank you very much, and I'll be here for anyone who wants to ask a question. If your stories are correctly sized. Now, they don't all have to be the same size, but you have had to do enough analysis so that we've gotten down to a point where they're reasonably sized. So a bit of variation isn't going to kill you, but a lot of variation will absolutely knock you stone dead. And a story that comes in and sits in the in progress box for 3 or 4 iterations, that blows the whole counting game out of the water. So we need to get our stories to the right size so that we can use the counting approach and get away from this huge level of uncertainty at the beginning. So Dan North has been talking about this for probably 7 or 8 years, and before him, Chris Matz was talking about it for 5 or 6 years before that, and there are loads of people that have been working in this space, understanding that, in fact, developing software is a process of learning something. We learn about the project, we learn about the technology, we learn about what we can achieve. And we need to get over the bit, we need to do as much of that learning up front, we need to get over that hump of ignorance at the beginning, because that's the stuff that stops us from being able to deliver. So, I mean, as developers, have you ever finished a project and said to yourself, if I was to do that project again, I would not do anything differently? I don't think so, because we learn. Every time we do something, we learn about it. So we're trying to get through this barrier of ignorance. And one of the problems I think that we have is that we're all experts, and we get scored and promoted and paid based on our expertise. And we don't like looking like we don't know something. This is borne out in sociological experiments where people have done tests and asked people questions to which they can reply with an answer, a fixed answer, or by saying, I don't know. And if you don't know, that's one thing. But if you answer with a fixed answer, then there's 2 possibilities. You're either right or you're wrong. And so there's these 3 possible outcomes when you ask someone a question. What do we use it to do? And the idea of feedback is that we learn from it, that we can see this, we can measure the feedback, we can gauge it, and we take an action based on the feedback that we see. And then we've got, it gets more complicated still. You can then measure, use your measurements on that feedback to choose which way to go. And in agile methods, what we're trying to do with the feedback is go to the customer and say, is this what you wanted? Is this going in the right direction? Is this enough? Can we stop going down this path now? Or have you got a new business requirement? Have the requirements changed? And you get the feedback loop, and you build experiments, and so you can do little spikes, and so you have low risk. Are we leaving the building? No. Okay, we're not leaving the building. So that's a feedback loop. We didn't learn, or did we learn? Yeah, so maybe that was a balancing feedback. Next time we'll burn up. Anyway, so we analyze, we learn, and we possibly change direction. So these are all just different representations of trying to get feedback, and using that feedback to improve the chance of delivering what the customer wants. Now, we have problems with the estimating, as Alan was talking about, because the things we're trying to estimate are really quite big, generally. And until we get into the detail of it, we don't know how big they are. So generally what happens is you go and you see a store and you might have a discussion about it, you may talk about some tasks that are in there, but until you actually get into working on that story, or at least delving down into it very deeply, you don't come up against the problems that are hidden within that story, within the feature that you're trying to develop. And this is a problem of scale, of how far away something is. So this is a jokey slide, but I think, despite the fact that it's fiction, they can answer correctly, or they can answer incorrectly, or they can say, I don't know. And it turns out that people are far, far more likely to answer definitively, irrespective of whether they're definitely going to be right or wrong, than they are to be uncertain. They prefer to be wrong than uncertain. And this is our problem when it comes to estimates. So if you get asked to estimate something, quite often the answer is, I have no idea. But we're not allowed to say that. And we don't like saying that because it makes us look ignorant. I'm going to ask you to move from the other side. For the rest of this session, let's assume that we're ignorant. We need to find out even the slightest details to work out how are we going to solve this problem. Is it solvable? Is it soluble? So given that this is, to some extent, a talk about agile and responding to change, I'm going to say that I'm slightly changing the plan over what was advertised in the brochure. So in the brochure, I said we were going to talk about TDD in the small first, and then deal with a larger user story. And while I was working on this presentation, I decided to flip them around. So we're going to work from outside in, and we're going to start with big stories first. So I'm going to spend the next section of this presentation talking about user stories and approaches to working with them, some of which will mesh in neatly with what Alan and, to some extent, Kevin was saying earlier. And then we'll dive down in some nitty-gritty detail with some code. So, user story land. can I just get a quick show of hands? Who doesn't use user stories at all? A few people. And keep your hands up if you don't know what they are. Okay, so I'm not going to go into any great deal of depth on user stories, because that's not the point here, as in what they are by definition. But I am going to say is that we're going to be dealing in this area here. We're looking at the stories, how we plan things, what we put into the backlog. And it's that part of the Scrum process. Now this is a developer conference, so I'm assuming that many people here are developers, or want to be developers, or ex-developers, or have some heritage in development. And so for us, I think XP was always a much more attractive methodology, because it didn't really talk so much about what meetings you should have and who should be doing retrospectives. It talked about the actual practices. However, Scrum doesn't. Scrum looks like this. And this is, just an overview. And basically, we've got lots of meetings specified. And here in the middle, we've got 2 to 4 weeks, which is your iteration, and you've got 24 hours for your daily retrospective. It doesn't say what you do in there. And if you look at the documentation for Scrum, it doesn't say who should be in there. They're just a team member, some sort of generic plug compatible, someone who can hit keyboards. So this is what we've got, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to deliver stuff out of here and give it to the customer. Now, you may think that, in fact, to some extent, you would be right if you thought that I'm being a little bit negative about Scrum, because I've seen a lot of failed implementations of Scrum, and I've seen very few successful ones. But it's trying to do something really important. It's trying to get something to the customer, or at least something that can be reviewed by the customer every 2 to 4 weeks. And that's a huge improvement over what we used to do on the Waterfall project, where you might not see the customer for a couple of years. And so the thing about all of these agile methods, and Scrum particularly, is that it's about feedback. It's about trying to learn about your mistakes, and you want to get that feedback quickly. But it's not just enough to get feedback. So there's lots of different sorts of feedbacks. If we have any systems thinkers in the room, or people that have worked with electronics, you'll know that there's positive reinforcing feedback, there's negative balancing feedback. So what are you going to do with this feedback? Father Ted, and clearly it's trying to tell a silly story, it really is the way it works. If you pick up something, you go, oh, that'll be easy. And 2 hours later, when you're in the debugger, you realize, no, I have to change that whole API, or that's not going to work because of the security manifest that's not on the right machine. And suddenly all the complexity arrives. That complexity was there to start with, you just hadn't seen it because you hadn't started working on it. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is about trying to get down into that detail early so that we can focus on the bits that are risky, we can focus on the bits where there may be unknowns lurking, and we focus on the bits that we need to do quickly up front so that we can begin to give people feedback about whether the project is feasible and what we might be able to deliver over the lifetime of that project. This is a very old graph. It's attributed to a guy called Barry Boehm, who is a researcher. It's been popularized by Steve McConnell in some of his books, and it's called the cone of uncertainty. And the interesting thing is that, well, let's start off by saying it's a cone, and here, the uncertainty about what you're trying to do is really quite large. And so the measurement that he's got here is that if you make an estimate right at the beginning of a project, you could be up to a factor of 4 out in both directions. And the closer you get to delivering, the more likely you are to make a good estimate. It's a really problem. It's a really big problem, because actually we get asked to make the estimates over at that end of the cone, not at this end of the cone. Because at this end of the cone, we really don't care about it. So we need to be able to uncover some of the uncertainty here so that we can begin to give some feedback to our managers about what's possible, what we can actually achieve. Alan talked about no estimates, and no estimates is a wonderful idea, but at some point, people still need to know what's going on. And his concept of counting stories works really well.